Hi, my name is Amiyah M, and welcome to Four People's Opinions, a podcast where we break down big historical moments into simple stories. Today we're diving into the Second Industrial Revolution, a time of incredible change that shaped the modern world. I'm going to talk about new industries, transportation, communication, and how industrialization spread to places like the United States and Russia. Let's get started. The Second Industrial Revolution, which lasted from the late 19th century to the early 20th century, was all major advancements in steel, chemicals, and electricity. These industries changed the way things were made and how people lived. For starters, steel would be used. Thanks to a process called the Bessemer process, steel could be made faster and cheaper than before. The process included removing impurities from molten iron through oxidation by blowing air on it. This stronger material replaced iron in buildings, bridges, and railroads, allowing cities to grow taller and transportation networks to expand. Then there were chemicals. Scientists found new ways to make fertilizers, which helped farms grow more food, and then they also developed synthetic dyes, making clothes and fabrics more colorful and affordable. And of course, electricity changed everything. Before electricity and the steam engine, factories had to be near water sources for power. But with electric generators, factories could be built anywhere and run all day. This increased production and led to new inventions like the light bulb and vehicles, making life in cities more convenient. All of these industries worked together, improving along the way. Steel and electricity improved transportation, allowing trains and ships to carry more goods and people faster than before. This leads us to think about how transportation and communication changed migration. Imagine living in the 1800s and wanting to move to a new city or even a new country. Before the Second Industrial Revolution, traveling was slow and difficult, but new advancements changed that. First, railroads expanded across the world, making it easier for people to migrate. For example, in the United States, the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, connected the East and West, helping settlers move westward and bring in new workers. In Russia, the Trans-Siberian Railway, completed in 1916, helped open up vast areas of land for industry and settlement. This railway is considered one of the largest railways in the world. After railroads, there were steamships. They were steam-powered vessels that used propellers driven by steam engines, and these were faster and cheaper than old sailing ships, and it made international migration much easier. Millions of people from Europe and Asia moved to places like the United States in search of jobs and better lives. Communication also improved as the telegraph, an invention that allowed people to send messages across long distances in minutes instead of days or weeks. Businesses could make decisions faster and people could stay connected with family even if they moved far away. These advancements in transportation and communication facilitated trade and migration by enabling the exchange of goods, ideas, and people across the globe, creating a more interconnected world. Industrialization wasn't just happening in one place, it was spreading. Let's compare how two countries, the United States and Russia, both went through industrialization. In the United States, industrialization was a huge success. The country had plenty of natural resources, a growing population, and a strong economy. Factories produced steel, textiles, and machines at record speeds, increasing the production of certain commodities. Immigrants provided a large workforce, and businesses thrived under capitalism. By the early 1900s, the U.S. was one of the most industrialized nations in the world. Russia, on the other hand, had a harder time. While they did build railroads like the Trans-Siberian Railway and grow their industries, industrialization was slower and less successful than in the U.S. The primary reason was political control. The Russian government, still ruled by czars, were monarchs who governed the Russian Empire and restricted economic freedom. Most Russians were peasants, working on farms with limited opportunities for moving to cities to secure factory jobs. By the early 1900s, Russia's industrialization efforts weren't strong enough to keep up with other world powers, and this would eventually lead to unrest and instability. The Second Industrial Revolution has changed the world in ways that have left an everlasting effect. New industries like steel, chemicals, and electricity created new possibilities for production and transportation. Railroads, steamships, and telegraphs connected the world entirely, influencing migration and global trade. And while industrialization was a major success in the U.S., Russia struggled to keep up. All countries have similar aspects during industrialization, but also very different.
Adding to that, 19th century Latin America didn't industrialize quite as quickly or as similarly as its predecessors did. Now, when you think Industrial Revolution, you would think iron, steamships, and things like that. But with Latin America having just been released from Spanish rule, the economic position was relying on their own exports to industrializing countries, and those countries' imports back to them, even though they believed in prosperity through free trade, despite other countries' dependency on taxing imports and exports. The elites of Latin America had an end goal to make their countries thrive like Europe. Mexico definitely had a push under rule of Porfirio Diaz. With him being a dictator, business was always in order. He had railroads built, some textile factories, electricity networks, and other things they'd heard of from the Europeans. Even attempts to invite the impoverished Europeans to their countries took place. With Latin America's proximity and an access to these revolutionary inventions, they weren't very up to speed with the technological advancements of Europe. Except for the fact that Latin America wasn't properly equipped for an industrial revolution, Diaz didn't have enough of the other factors to keep revolutionizing. Along with several reforms due to labor conditions and economic upkeep, although they aspired to be as successful as Europeans, that wasn't necessarily the case, and the region remained unstable for a while. Latin America continued to undergo dependent development, with other countries surviving off of imports. This cycle continued for generations and slowed down development greatly.
To reduce social inequality, a system called socialism, where factories and land were owned by the government, this aimed to distribute wealth equally. However, the system was a response to capitalism, which is where individuals own the means of production, making a profit in a competitive market and being driven by the personal gain. Some complained that the government could overreach and individuals had less economic freedom. Marxists had a solution to this. The solution was to revolt and take control of the means of production, which resulted in a classless society. Around the same time, labor movements in the 19th century mostly focused on improving working conditions for factory workers. They also advocated for better pay, shorter hours, having safer working environments, and an end to child labor. This was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, which caused rapid urbanization. Some ways they succeeded were by going on strike, which pressured employers. They boycotted companies and used public awareness for public support.
Now that we've discussed the labor movements in the 19th century, we can talk about how the Ottomans and the Qing responded to the Europeans' industrialization. The Ottomans sought to reform by modernizing their efforts, while the Qing did resist change until they established their self-strengthening movement. But they didn't industrialize immediately, unlike Japan, for example. How the Ottomans responded to the Europeans' industrialization was they reformed their military, their tax collectors, they also built more roads, and they created a postal service system. They also built more textile factories, they implemented Western law codes and courts, and they also used a expansive education system. This was all led by a sultan named Muhammad II. They faced some economic challenges such as lacking capital, infrastructure, an efficient tax system, and etc. After Muhammad's rule, they tried to reform more, which is also known as the Tanzimat reforms. The Tanzimat reforms decreased government corruption, made a non-religious education system, they confided law, updated their legal system to emphasize equality more, and they also upgraded their infrastructure with more Western infrastructure. They did have limited access when implementing the Tanzimat reforms, so they did fail to a degree to fully modernize. The Ottomans did keep patriarchy when reforming, and they weren't able to keep up with Europeans when industrializing, and because of this, another sultan named Hamid ended these reforms. As for the Qing and how they responded to the Europeans' industrialization, was China dealt with more internal and external pressures by the European nations than the Ottomans did, because the European nations were trying to carve China for their trade rights. Also, Great Britain battled China from the sale of opium, a drug, which also led to the Opium Wars. All this led China to reform. China had great trade with Western countries, so they did adapt some of their things like their technology and infrastructure. They reformed by establishing a self-strengthening movement led by Xing Gufan, Li Hongzhang, and Zhao Zongtang.
The movement was to modernize China from its industrial age. They wanted to industrialize but also keep their culture. The movement abolished the civil service exam. It also eliminated corruption and reformed their medical systems and practices. China's self-strengthening, though, wasn't a successful movement because some of China didn't like the new reforms because of the increasing foreign trade on China. This led to the Boxer Rebellion, which was an uprising against all the foreign things in China because they wanted to protect the traditional Chinese culture. Boxers saw the Qing as weak, so they wanted to overthrow the Qing and ban its foreign influence from China, which led to them have a strict control over foreign trade in their Canton system. The further weakening of the Qing was some nations desired China's lucrative market, so they sent troops to stop this rebellion, which led to the further collapse. These efforts were unsuccessful when it came to matching the pace of the Europeans' industrialization, which further led to a more foreign influence and instability in China. And that's all for today about the second industrial rev. Thanks for watching. For People's Opinions, out.